Operating Officer of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis. Today's webinar, just so everybody, will be using a webinar format for the meeting. So while you're all muted, you can still ask questions either through the chat or the Q&A function. And we will have some time at the end of the presentation for some questions. I'd now like to introduce Greg Gowitz, Board Chair of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis.
Thanks, Don. Again, I'm Greg Gowitz. I'm Board Chair of the Jewish Federation, and I just want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar. We're really excited to give you this opportunity to meet Patrick Gallagher, who you will hear about and then hear from soon. I want to take this time also to thank all of our staff and volunteers of HMLC for their great leadership as we work through this important project. I want to thank all of those of you who have taken the time to connect with us today to learn more about where we are in the project. And again, say, as I've said before on prior webinars, this is an extremely important project for our community, for our federation, and for the greater St. Louis community. And with that, I'd now like to introduce Carol Steinberg, who is chair of the Holocaust Museum Capital Campaign, who will introduce Patrick. You're muted, Carol.
There you go. So glad you're all here with us today. About 4 years ago, the HMLC began a process of developing a plan to renovate and expand into a new museum. So we really had to go out into the world, which Patrick is part of, to find a designer. And we did. We found the best designer out there, and that is Gallagher Associates. So Patrick and his team, as you can see here, his bio, joined the project in January of 2017. And he has been a great partner, teacher, and friend to all of us as we have navigated this whole process of designing and building a new world-class museum. His breadth of projects is very impressive, and he has done several Holocaust museums around the world. We're excited that he is here with us today to talk about current museum trends and, of course, our project. And with that, I will hand it over to Patrick.
Thanks, Carol. Good evening, everyone. I recognize some names out there. I wish I could see your faces. We will, I'm sure, be together soon. This, I know, will all be behind us in the future, and we'll eventually be able to celebrate where we are in the design process in a more face-to-face fashion. But in the meantime, today I want to give you kind of a broad context of understanding a little bit first about who your partner is, and that's a little bit about my firm and some of the projects that we're involved in. Then I want to talk about some of the current trends that are happening in museums today. And it's not necessarily current design trends as much as it is the structural interpretive trends for museums and things that we're considering as we think about and develop new museums. And that includes a little bit of a perspective on where we are with the current pandemic that we're in and how that's affecting museums, because it's clearly changing the cultural landscape. And then we're going to get into a broad overview of where we are in the design for your museum. I will tell you that we have a much deeper deck for design, but it's a deck that is really for the working team. So some of the detail would be a little challenging for everyone to understand. So I'm going to try to just keep it at the top level and a view into one of the elements that's going to make this museum unique, and that's our lab. So we'll, again, keep this at a very high level. You'll have an opportunity to ask some questions at the end, and if we run short on time, we certainly can have you send in questions that I can respond to or anyone on the team can respond to. Don's going to drive the deck for me. So Don, you want to go to the next slide? So the Gallagher Associates is headquartered in Washington, D.C. We have offices in New York, Portland, and Singapore. And these are some of the countries that we currently have museums either under development or under construction, with opening sometime in the next few years. We have a very important and exciting project opening in Israel this year. It'll be opening in October. It's the complete redevelopment. For those of you who know the museum, Beit Futsot, it will be reopening as the Museum of the Jewish People, looking at the history of the Jewish people. So we're excited about that. I'm going to give you a little sneak peek into a museum that just opened last week. Next slide, Don. The firm is an integrated design firm, and we take an integrated approach to our work, which means that we work in physical design, interpretive planning and design, digital and interactive media. We have a full research and content development division, and then we have a division called Gallagher Museum Services that does operational planning, business planning, and financial feasibility work, so that we can help our clients envisioning both the short-term and long-term operations and developments of their institutions. Next. Experience design, which is probably the foundation of everything that we do, is really where everything that you're going to see today begins, and it is part of how we bring visitors into physical spaces and engage in interpretive storytelling. Next slide. We do a great deal of foundational research and development on our museums, and as many of you who have been involved in this museum knows, that at the master planning phase, it wasn't about design, it was about story. And we're going to talk a lot about that today, because that's the important framing for how you develop or hang an experience around an idea or story, and how you then bring the collection in to make that story more textural and real. Next slide, Don. Over the past 10 years, as you all know, because you're, I'm sure, out visiting museums, digital media has become an important part of the experience for visitors. It's both mandated by the way we live, the way our students learn, and also the opportunity for us to make it a story more textual and offer visitors more optional tracks for interpretation and engagement. I'll talk a little bit about that further when we talk about trends, but our digital and interactive division bases its entire process on the integration of design, so that in the physical environment, that seamless interaction with story isn't about just what happens on screen, but what happens to you when you're challenged by an idea and engaged in the content. So understand the appropriate engagement levels with technology or physical design really has been a driver in transforming what happens to museums today. Next slide, Tom. And then as we are firm believers in, museums are businesses. So building a strong foundation on your operational and strategic business plan is an important part of why and how museums will survive. And in particular, right now, in this condition of COVID-19, many museums are struggling because they didn't have the backbone of a solid operating plan and a solid business plan. So that's as important to our process as is the design and development. Next slide. We're going to go through quickly some current projects, just to give you a highlight of the diversity of the work that we're involved in, because I want you to have a better feeling for an understanding for who we are. This is the new International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. We just opened this museum this year. It's a deeply interactive institution and takes a look at the broad depth and breadth of espionage and intelligence all the way up to current times, and very much looking into the future. Next slide. It has in the museum one of the only true infinity rooms in the United States. It's a full projected environment and a full surround environment that responds to the engagement of the visitors. And so every time you come in, you get a different type of engagement based on the kind of questions and responses that visitors bring to their own level of understanding. National World War II Museum in New Orleans is, last year was considered by TripAdvisor one of the top 3 museums in the world. And that's all based on visitor response. It's been about a 15-year project for us and a highly engaged project. And I think the important part, and we'll go to the next slide, Don, is really just not the types of engagement, but where we're going with the story. This museum is now looking at the future and taking the relevance of and the lessons learned in World War II and looking at them in a much more contemporary perspective based on the world that we're living in today. And that's an important part of the conversation that we'll be having with your lab. Next slide. This is a project for Johnson & Johnson. They came to us a few years ago, not only to archive their entire historical collection of documents and artifacts, but also to save one of the most important historic buildings on the Johnson & Johnson campus. This is one of the first buildings of the original corporation, and to create an outreach message for both an internal audience and an external audience. Next slide. And to take that content and develop the first virtual museum that we've developed it and will be a part of the language of the future in how virtual museums are bringing visitors back to the messages and contents and stories of both museums and corporations. This, next slide. This is a pretty dynamic environment. They use it for public presentations, public education, and for engaging their partners worldwide. So they can reach out to any of their partners worldwide from here, and they host their entire company worldwide from this platform for town hall meetings on a quarterly basis. Next slide. This is the new Bell Natural History Museum and Planetarium. It's the largest new planetarium in the United States, just opened this year. It's at the campus of the University of Minnesota and brings together some of the most important historic dioramas in museums today, as well as some of the most contemporary science and research being done in university settings today on the environment and the natural resources of the state of Minnesota. Next slide. Incredible collection of mounted material, but also, again, we restored 16 of the most important dioramas that this institution used for teaching students back in the 1800s and brought them up with technology into a contemporary experience space for the museum. Next slide. Just down the road from you in Chicago is the Chicago Center for Architecture. This is on the Chicago River. It examines the history of and impact of architecture in Chicago. As many of you understand, architecture and Chicago are synonymous. This is one of the great cities for architecture in America. Next slide. So this is a dynamic learning center as well about city planning and urbanization. This interactive model actually is a model that shows the evolution of the city through both a projected and three-dimensional environment. And we're now building a version of this as an augmented reality piece where people will be able to use it at home through an AR, VR system as well. Next slide. We also do a great deal of work in arts and arts education. This is a project that we did for the state of Mississippi. It's called the Mississippi Arts and Entertainment Experience. It's how the state is reaching out to their communities and their schools through art education. This involves both the physical arts, music, written word, dance, and part of the way that the state's education department can reach out to challenged learners and to communities that are often underserved in the state. Next slide. It also has an important theatrical center to it that's used for the ongoing programming of music and the arts for the state, and is part of their revenue base for operations and sustainability. Next slide. This is the Whitty Museum. You saw a shot of this earlier. It's the largest natural history museum in the southern part of the United States. It's based in San Antonio, Texas. That ceiling in this lobby is actually a digital ceiling. So you can see this recreated dinosaur fly across the ceiling of the lobby. So we do have a mix of both digital engagement and, again, the static and historic mounts that the museum has held for over 100 years. The engagement, next slide. The engagement here is based on the native peoples of the state of Texas. The native people in the state of Texas are some of the earliest inhabitants of the landscape that is now called the United States. At that time, it was part of Mexico, and they have one of the richest collections of cave paintings anywhere in the United States. And here we can actually, through virtual technology, allow you to see those cave paintings in a natural environment. Next slide. Here's a peek at the newest museum that we've opened, and this just opened last week. This is the new U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum in Colorado Springs. This has been defined as the most accessible museum in America. Because of our Paralympians, they wanted to be sure that this museum was fully accessible to all visitors at every level, with every form of physical challenge. And they were our partners in design. Next slide. And it'll is many opportunities as we can allow our visitors to train like an Olympian, understand what the commitments and sacrifices of our American Olympians are, and really celebrate the commitment that these Olympians have made for this country. Next slide. Highly interactive space, dynamic museum. For those of you who are architectural buffs, this building was designed by Diller Scafidio of New York, who designed the new extension to MoMA and the Shed project in Hudson Yards. Next slide. It has a collection of both some of the newest and some of the most historic technology in how we train our Olympic athletes. This is a precursor to allowing visitors to go over to the visitor center and engage at the training center, an actual opportunity to see athletes in training at the U.S. Olympic Training Center. Next slide. This is an immersive theater, a full surround theater on the medaling ceremonies at the games. We've got a number of those types of surround media environments that really put you at the time and place, uses actual footage from the games themselves. And as you can see, projected on the floor, the newest form of defining social distancing in museums. So we had to think very carefully about how we were going to handle social distancing in this new museum, and it's an integrated part of how this museum will operate from now and into the future. Next slide. I want to now take you into what I had mentioned earlier when we started this conversation, was just a little bit of a discussion about what we think about in designing a museum today. And this comes from not just our experiences with clients like yours, but our experiences with educators, historians, scientists, researchers, social anthropologists, people who help us in putting together the storytelling aspect of the experiences that we develop for museums. So storytelling is really at the heart of that. It's about dynamically engaging, educating, and motivating people to create measurable impact. And when we say measurable impact, that's going to be something that we're going to talk about in your museum. Every interactive that we develop for institutions today have back-end technology that allows us to measure and gauge how well people are engaging with content, the time that they're spending, the kind of responses they're giving us, so that the museum can begin to learn the types of patterns and questions that visitors are asking and are involving themselves with when they're at the museum. Next slide, Don. So as I mentioned, at the heart of everything we do is storytelling. And why? Because we're adding context to the experience, orchestrating the highs and lows and creating those unexpected moments. This is the first thing that we do in thinking about any institution, because it's that infrastructure that'll allow us to select the types of collections and think about the types of experiences. So we're also thinking about how we can personalize that experience and layer the information in accessible ways to give context to people's lives. And we want to consider what technology and what techniques will bring that story to life, whether it's collections, oral history, media, combination of all of the above, or engagement platforms in the stories that are really the most foundational part of any engagement in a museum. Next slide. And what's happening today in national and international trends is, to be honest with you, prior to the pandemic, the museum industry is one of the fastest growing industries in the tourism marketplace. More money was being put into museums and communities around the world than theme parks and retail environments combined. The pandemic is, of course, challenging that. And what we're beginning to see is how people's feelings and loyalty toward their cultural environments will remain committed to seeing these institutions reopening. So the foundation of this relationship was both an emotional relationship, but it was also an economic relationship, because many communities used culture as a way to revitalize their economies in the post-industrial era. So museums were driving not just tickets and sales at the door of the institution, but hotel stays, restaurant and retail impact, taxes. So the whole realigning of the economic impact of museums is going to have to be reassessed after COVID to see how museum or communities can reinvest in bringing these cultural institutions back to life. There clearly are a lot of institutions struggling, and you will see a loss of many of the smaller museums that didn't have enough endowment or a real vital connection to their community to make them survive. And through all this, we're seeing the definition of museum changing. We've kind of blurred the lines between what we call the museum experience in a physical space, and we now have to consider the virtual museum. Not just a walk through collections, but a real in-depth contextual storytelling that can happen online. More people went back online to visit their museums when the pandemic hit than any of us had ever expected. And many institutions found themselves somewhat flat-footed because they didn't have enough content to support a continued engagement with their visitors. So we really need to understand more and more in the future what our at-home marketplace space will be with our members. And keeping our audiences connected is important, not just through the pandemic, but what happens in their post-visit experience as well as their pre-visit experiences. And it's not just walking through collections digitally. They want stories, they want content, and they want engagement with the people that run these museums, curate these museums, and actually are the people that can give them the untold stories they don't often find at the institution. Next slide. The definition of engagement is changing as well. You want to jump? There you go, Don. The boundaries of interpretation are wide open. The use of technology and collections to bring visitors into a deeper level of learning is happening more and more every day. And what we mean by that is allowing visitors to tap into an inquiry-based dialogue with an institution when they find something that interests them, that surprises them, that challenges them. We want them to be able to go deeper and satisfy their own needs for information. So there's no longer one track for a visitor. There's multiple tracks for multiple visitors based on what they're interested in and what they're looking for. Next slide. We're also seeing education and learning styles throughout the world impact the museum industry. Students around the world today are more diverse and multilingual and than they've ever been, but we're also seeing huge gaps in not just the social divide and how that's separating certain students away from museums and bringing others to museums. So we really need to understand how we can make museums more accessible to students, not just the ones who feel empowered or they have the opportunity, but the ones who feel like they can't get to an institution or they're uncomfortable in an institution because culture wasn't a part of their family life. So schools are also having to deal with more challenges of free choice learning styles. That's changing on an annual basis and will continue to change. It'll continue to change based on what's happening with COVID, and it'll continue to change as we see some of these broader cultural and social issues really push the demands of how education can bring contemporary voice into the classroom today. So the attitudes toward relevancy and immediacy and the needs for identity and personal collections, it needs to be more of a true reflection of the world that these students live in, has to be found in our institutions as well. Next slide. What do we know about our visitors today? There's some really fairly simple questions that visitors ask us, and we continue to find this both in the United States and around the world. They want to know, before I come to this museum, what's in it for me? How does it relate to my family and my community? How does it understand my perspective? And is there going to be a payoff for me? And I don't think that we're necessarily saying we have to pander to these kind of questions. We just need to understand the context of why they're being asked. And we need to be able to embrace that level of inquiry so that they can find a place in the museum and a story that looks like them and will get them into a sense of understanding that this is a place that they should feel welcome in. So we will ask these questions of ourselves throughout the development of any institution, because we need to always think with the lens of the visitor. Next slide. Museums must be relevant and honest and truthful. Now more than ever, we're finding institutions challenged and thinking carefully about actually doing some reinterpretation of their story. Not just history museums, but science museums and cultural museums, art museums. They're all asking, am I accessible to all audiences? Have I told a balanced story? Am I embracing the perspectives that people bring that we may not have looked at 10 or 15 years ago? So no longer can one interpretive style be acceptable. And we have to look at the social and cultural perspectives that visitors are bringing to museums today. We can't be a one-size-fits-all institution. That attitude comes and can create a person who may never visit your museum again. So we want to be able to create a narrative voice that allows that visitor to engage in their own guest experience. We have to understand the community that we're working in and our potential audience to be sure that we engage in an appropriate dialogue with those visitors. Next slide. And I have to tell you that today's museums just aren't about their permanent collections and permanent exhibitions. Like you, especially like you, you're thinking very strategically. Public programming through dynamic engagements have become a critical part of the learning model for museums today. Museums are modeling themselves around the needs of their community and making their stories accessible through a variety of lenses for the diversity of their visitors. Museums today with historical narratives are looking carefully at how to make that narrative relevant in a contemporary dialogue. As I mentioned, we're working with the National World War II Museum on their last building, and it's on the post-World War II era all the way up to today, and how the relevance of World War II remains in the contemporary dialogue. And trust me, it's the most challenging part of the museum we've ever developed, and it will be the most important part of the museum that ever gets developed, because it's part of what will allow the museum to continue an active dialogue with its visitors. Next slide, Don. I mentioned it earlier, and it's something that we had a discussion about with your team and will continue to have a discussion about, is as we're developing these new museums, we have to keep in mind what your virtual footprint will look like once that museum opens. There is becoming a louder mandate for keeping visitors engaged and how museums reach a wider audience profile through its virtual museum and what kind of geographic impact it can have. We're seeing with COVID, visitors from around the world are searching for stories and content that interest them, and there are no boundaries anymore. So we have the opportunity to create network relationships with other collections, other exhibitions, other programs, with museums virtually anywhere around the world. This will mean that we truly need to understand our exclusive narrative and how that fits in your institution, so that when someone comes to you, whether that's a visitor sitting at home in front of their own computer, or an audience of students at another museum halfway around the globe, they'll understand why they should engage with your museum in St. Louis. Next slide. Obviously, technology is something that we consider not just on-site, but off-site. It's created a wide variety of new interpretive tools that can enhance what we call the exhibition marketplace. It allows us to not just interpret with a higher degree of fidelity, but it allows us to make the environments change based on what people are interested in. It can set the context for time and place. It also can allow visitors to ask questions. We all know the impact of social media. If we don't allow visitors to leave their thoughts or ask us questions, they'll do it when they go out on their own, and some of it you might not like. So we might as well encourage positive engagement with our visitors and allow them to both question what they're experiencing, respond to what they're experiencing, and go beyond learning, but to a certain degree, teach us about what they understand and don't understand. So it will really help us in understanding the diversity of learning styles and enhance our opportunities for things like programming and changing exhibitions. Next slide. As I mentioned, this is allowing us to connect to a much broader worldwide audience. Your museum, along with many other Holocaust museums around the world, have collections that are important. The most important being your collections of oral histories and survivor testimonials. Every institution that has those collections and carefully cares for those collections are part of a wider landscape of the contextualization of the survivor story on a global scale. So how we can connect and collect stories from other institutions based on ideas that or concepts that came, or thoughts or events that came from our survivors, can allow us to connect to this wider opportunity of institutions worldwide. So the opportunity to collect and protect is going to be an important part of why your museum is distinct to your community and to your collections of oral histories. And it's going to become important that from here on into the future, we can no longer count visitors through the door. We need to be able to count those who connect with you on your website. Next slide. So let's jump right into your museum. As I said, this is a work in progress. So we're gonna move through this pretty quickly because you're gonna see this more often as we update it. This is the floor plan of the museum and the Impact Lab, and it's adjacent to the auditorium, as you can see off to the upper right. Next slide, Don. I'll let you just keep marching. Here's kind of an axonometric view or a three-dimensional view of what the museum layout will be. It is a sequenced experience, meaning it's a linear perspective. Teachers can start anywhere they want in the interpretation of the museum, but the average visitor will follow a more structured experience through the museum, starting with an intro theater and closing with a closing theatrical experience. Next slide. just a view into our thematic areas. These are all becoming much more fully developed. 1.1's in our intro area. That's our intro theater. And then they'll progress through section 2 in a very chronologic fashion and into the heart of the museum, which is area 3. And we'll get a look at each of these areas with a little more depth as I get further into this. And then what brings our St. Louis survivor gallery to life, and how visitors can engage with that. And then the closing media experience, and then is 6.0 a reflection area, or what we're calling the reflection hall. Next slide. We're basing the entire interpretive framework or narrative on something called the line of Jewish life. And that's the through line of our approach, is akin to the story of Jewish life, free-flowing and organic. The story of the Holocaust interrupts and breaks and scatters that line. This dispersal continues afterwards and comes back together until it finally knits itself into the story of our community today and recognizes the resilience of our Jewish people. So that thread of that line is an important part of our design mandate. Next slide. This story will then be told through authentic Jewish and historic voices, through the oral histories, through the great collections and artifacts and important images. The design language is the underpinning, inspired by and in service of the story. That line sets the tone and builds a cohesive experience. The line will represent for us presence, tension, interruption, and dispersal. Next slide. So let's take a look at some of the key experiences. The theater, the introductory theater, really looks at the diversity of Jewish life before, and excuse me, it's basing it on memory. And because of that memory, at times it will have more, again, more fidelity, and other times it will seem a bit more distant. So or transparent or translucent. Next slide, Don. We want this to have a look and feel that at times is impacted by almost the effect of refracted light or shifting imagery. It'll have layering to it and transparency and illumination. So it does feel like a memory, and it will bring in moments of vibrancy. At times will be softer and more dreamlike, but sets the tone of what we lost in the world before. Next slide. It will be a surround environment. We haven't determined the final format for the screens yet, so we're just looking at the number of people that we'll be able to put into that space and how we'll treat it with our technology and the screens. Next slide. We're studying the materiality of those screens, both the translucency of it and transparency of it, as well as creating the opportunity for some ambient soundscapes and directional ambient audio to give it a more human texture. We're looking at how those screens, again, will wrap around our visitors through using light and kind of that dreamlike transparency, so that it has a gentle dimensional layered look. Next slide. As you move into area 2, we're really looking at that moving that life before. And what I've done is I've selected some very key design elements that we're using to engage the team. So as we go through each of these sections, I'll show you different things that we're looking at as we work with the museum team to engage how the spaces will begin to look. So in this area, we're looking heavily at the graphic language. How are we going to be using typography, color, photography, and graphics? Next slide. How we use a graphic hierarchy, meaning how will the written word be used? Yes, people do still read in museums. It's an important part of the dialogue we have with our visitors. Interactivity will be important, but the core experience will also be portrayed through this hierarchy of text, panels, and interpretation. Next slide. Starting to look at how some of that interpretation then becomes more physical. You can see that ribbon that's running through here. That's also part of that whole infrastructure of the line of life that we talked about. and how it begins to fracture as we go in through our storytelling. These models are helping us understand throughput as well. We have to look really carefully at throughput now based on the conditions of COVID-19, how we'll, in the future, if we have to do social distancing, how that'll happen. Next slide. Area three is the heart of our experience, where we're really looking at the events of the Holocaust, and you could see the chapters are beginning to unfold here. And again, that kind of golden line that's running through there is that thread of our story. We're just starting our modeling and beginning to test these spaces for not only capacities, but how we'll integrate collections and graphics together. Next slide. So here in each of the areas, each of these sections will have their own defined color and graphic style, their own graphic language, and we'll be testing these in full-size mock-ups soon. We'll get user testing so they can give us our reactions not only to the copy counts, but colors and type styles and their kind of reactions to how that engages with them. Next slide. Just taking a look at a modeling here. We're using kind of a dimensional motif to these environments, or a layered motif. Again, this is helping our team understand, and the architecture team understand more about what physical space will feel like and how we will not only use them for interpretation, but how we'll light them and manage the flow through of content. Next slide. The St. Louis Survivors Gallery, obviously one of the most important galleries for us. Here we have the chance for visitors to both flow through the gallery, as you can see in the top diagram, or sit and really engage with survivor stories. So we have two wraparound spaces where visitors can sit, excuse me, in an environment of layered imagery, both static and interactive. There'll be screens that will have survivor testimonials in them in the center, which will allow visitors to sit down for more in-depth engagement. On the opposing side, as they flow through, next slide, Tom. So you can see what that'll be like on the left. So there'll be both graphic and photographic engagement. There'll be live oral histories through the screens. And again, we're using that layered approach. On the wall behind, we're going to be doing some light projections. There'll be quotes and names and signatures of our survivors that will appear as projections on that wall so that we can really personalize the experience of the St. Louis survivors. Next slide. Here you can see their signatures happening on the wall, and those will appear and disappear as the visitors move through the space. So the space has always got a dynamic character to it. We also think there'll be a whisper element to this. So as the name is signed, you'll hear the person's name being spoken. And our closing media experience is one that is, again, a partial wraparound experience. It brings that story back. It's our thread of life comes back together again. And again, we're going to use our survivors to tell the stories of their lives post the Holocaust, so that there is a continuity again to life here. So we open up with memories of lives lost and communities lost, but we want to close with the rebuilding of those communities. We want to build some sense of that there is a strength in all of this story. So using our survivors will really give us a chance to do that. Next slide. Again, this is a wraparound theatrical experience. It's both a walkthrough and a sit-down opportunity. It will pattern itself in a mosaic across the wall. It'll be both the projections of and sound bites from the survivors themselves, quotes, as well as photographic imagery to really understand the rebuilding of their lives here in the United States and in Cleveland. And St. Louis, I'm sorry. Next slide. So you can see it will be a space that wraps around our visitors, and how we use the mosaic of that space to fully encompass them will be an important part of the experience. Next slide, Don. And then our reflective space is a space that we offer visitors to go in and sit, to gather their thoughts, to think about or discuss with someone what they were feeling, how this experience impacted them. It will be a slightly darker space. We're going to use what we're referring to as points of light to represent those lives that were lost. And we're looking at how that will wrap around the visitor. Next slide. Whether that's actual wraparound space using the ceiling and the walls, or next slide, or potentially be more of a sculptural element in the center of the space. So we're still studying the design on this. Next slide. Now that I want to give you a broad overview, and I'm going to keep this very high level because the Impact Lab is a piece that foundationally, I know everyone's believes and is committed to. We're not as deep into the content yet as we are the museum, but we are about to jump into this. I've assigned a very senior producer to this who will lead the discussion and development of the content as we go through the development of the lab. Next slide, Don. The Impact Lab is very much connected to and built on the foundation of the tenets of the Holocaust, and is engaged in how we take those lessons learned from the Holocaust and bring them up into a contemporary narrative. It's not just happening at your museum, they're doing it now more effectively at the US Holocaust Museum, and it's going to become an important part of the lasting legacy of Holocaust museums around the world. Next slide. The Impact Lab will be used as a foundational lesson of the Holocaust to explore contemporary issues and events for the visitor to understand how they as an individual can act to make a difference. Using dynamic programming and interactive media, the Impact Lab will foster deeper connections and provoke thoughtful dialogue. I want everybody to understand that these are not necessarily closed stories. Every visitor will have an opportunity to impact on their own story based on how they respond to a particular idea, story, or narrative, so that every time they come, they can have a deeper and different perspective of what they're interested in and what they would like to learn more about. So these aren't about closed stories. This is about having a more open dialogue. Next slide. The vision is in exploring the Holocaust's relevance today on a local and national and global events impact us in this flexible and interactive digital space. The visitors will learn how the Third Reich exploited their sectors to corrupt the important democratic institutions like media, representative government, and human rights. These experiences empower participants to confront their own biases, understand the sources of power and information, and to take action and support others in their own life. Next slide. We're looking carefully at what some of the potential key takeaways will be. Things like standing up and taking action, awareness and education and informational literacy, compassion and empathy, respect for others, being able to engage in civil discourse, collaboration, and accountability. All of these in differing degrees based on the experiences that get developed. And all of this has to be yet developed to its next level of reality and how these will roll out as program in the Impact Lab. Next slide. Audience groups, we're looking at school groups ages grades 6 through 12, university students and their faculty, young adults, families, professional groups like law enforcement, attorneys, medical professionals in the military, nonprofit, government agencies and corporations. We feel like this has great relevance for people within your community who are looking for a place to open up these kinds of dialogues. Next slide. The important work that was done with Change Begins With Me will be kind of the springboard and has been for how we look at developing an infrastructure for the guest experience. And that's what this really looks at, is how the space can get divided into these areas of activity where we allow visitors to choose, decide, question, discover, listen, and discuss, and how that interpretive architecture will get zoned and how technology can change or support each of these very key steps in understanding more about the experience for our visitors. Next slide. So we're beginning to zone out the lab, the Impact Lab. So these are just really looking at giving each of the areas, discuss and share, question, choose or decide, listen and discover. These are all in their preliminary state right now, and I'm sure you'll see some change as we get deeper and richer into our discussions and we start doing some audience testing so that we know that we are engaging with the appropriate balance. Next slide. These next slides are just for our working with the museum to think about ways that we might be able to engage with visitors through different forms of technology, through user group interactives. So in choose and decide, how we can use a group interactive potentially with a large screen and individual screens. Next slide. In questioning, how we'll allow visitors to have multiple tracks of engagement. That might happen through the table-based interactive. We're still thinking these through, but it's often helpful to have a platform of an idea to work with so that the team can challenge it and manipulate their own thinking as we begin to develop each of these further. Next slide. Discovery we know will be a little bit more on a personal level. So getting the potential for visitors to be more on a one-on-one with someone, actually look someone in the eye and ask them questions and have a dialogue. So we're really thinking about the idea that for each visitor, they can have a dialogue with this space and discover a bit more about themselves, but also discover the perspective of others. Next slide. And listening, of course, being one of the most important things that a visitor can do here, and both on a personal level and as a group, because as you listen, you motivate discussion. So listening and how that will happen, whether that's by group or individual, we're still beginning to explore what some of the opportunities and potentials are. Next slide, Tom. And then most importantly, the last area is a group area for discussion and sharing. No one should feel like that this is a closed experience at the lab, that they'll have a chance, whether they're in a family group or whether they're in a school group, to talk about what their own individual biases, concepts, or conclusions are from what they experienced here. This lab can be the foundation for real future programming as the needs for the community grow, and as you see schools and user groups coming with broader questions that they would like the museum to address, we can continue to develop that program and install it in these platforms. So the technology platforms are flexible. It's the programmatic platforms that are really what's going to bring the texture and the quality experience to our visitors. Next slide. And that is it. And I'm going to take a breath. I know we put a lot in front of you, and as I said, wanted to give you not just the broadest context of where we are from design, and you'll see a lot more texture and detail in the not too distant future, but also the beginnings of what we're thinking about for the lab, as well as just some of the things that we've all had to think about in the development of the museum today, both on-site and off-site. And Don, happy to open this up to any
Sure.
questions.
So I think some people submitted questions via the chat function, and also you can do via Q&A. I'm going to hand it off to Lori, who's been monitoring and who will pose the questions, Patrick. Go ahead, Lori.
All right. So this is the only question that came in when you were going through the trends of museum design. The rest of the questions came in specific to our experience. So to what extent should a museum, or more specifically an element such as the Impact Lab, reflect in some form its location in history? Is it important, for example, to somehow include Ferguson in an exhibit or one of the lessons the new HMLC will try to teach?
It is important to reflect the community that you're in. I think there's more than enough opportunities like Ferguson to use as part of our programming in the Impact Lab, because it makes people understand that you're thinking about them as a community. So whether we choose Ferguson or another event, the Impact Lab should reflect on the St. Louis community.
Will the tours through the museum have a way to keep sections quiet?
Were the tours?
I think I'm speaking because I know I have a loud voice and people have told me that they can hear, they're trying to talk to their students and they can hear me. So in the design of the exhibit, will it, when docents give tours, will the design enable that the docent voice stays in one gallery?
We are working on that we have an acoustical engineer that'll be helping us, and understand that technologies today, especially related to some of the new media, we have very directional sound systems now that can has what's called a waterfall effect. So as you get further away from it, it actually drops off. So we are paying close attention to that because we know that that will disturb the experience for the visitors. So yes, a lot of attention is being given to the acoustical value of the space.
This question is also about docent guided tours. So please address your design criteria for guided docent tours. Our groups can be up to 30 students in a tour. Will spaces accommodate the size of our student tours?
That's why you saw the modeling that we're doing of the space. We have to make we're going to have to make the decision about accommodating not just the tours, but the size of tours. What you're doing today may not be the same format of what we're going to be doing in a new space because it's a different space. So we'll be modeling that in the physical environment, and that's something that we're going to be working on as we go further and further into it. Do we have it 100% developed at this point? No, we need to understand more fully about timing of the experiences, what the dwell time for our visitors are going to be in each of the areas, and then what is an appropriate number of people to be in each of those spaces. So we're working diligently to try to model out what those will be.
There were two questions, and you touched on this, but I'm going to ask them anyways to see if you want to elaborate further. If the Impact Lab will have a component that will allow the narrative to pivot quickly with changing content to reflect contemporary news, social issues. With Change Begins With Me, it was hard to update the software that when Pittsburgh happened, it took a long time to get that on the map. So will this technology be, will it be easily updatable with new content?
Yeah, it will be. There'll be a part of the content that the museum team could update on a daily basis if they wanted to. They'll have the ability to be able to input new perspectives every day. There's also a number of new algorithms out there that we're looking at that will allow the museum, the Impact Lab, to reach out through the internet and pull down content on a daily basis that's related to anything that's in the lab. So we can keep it fresh with material that's happening out there. Because as you all know, the amount of content that's flooded in the internet on a daily basis can be daunting. So we have a way to reach out and grab that automatically. And then we have to figure out how to filter that and get that into a more manageable format in the Impact Lab. And it is important to remember that part of the foundation of thinking about the Impact Lab is visitors are going to have a role in thinking about those stories and ideas as it relates to them. So as they input their own thought, that will change the format of a particular experience. So these are open-ended experiences to a certain degree because we want it to relate to everyone's individual life.
Relating to the Impact Lab, could that include content for 4th and 5th grade students?
There is the potential for that, and I won't say we won't do that. it just depends on, you have to have very age-specific content. And that's if the museum team decides they want to include that age group, then we just have to make sure that we have age-appropriate content for that age group.
Going forward from COVID, will materials used for seating be fabric or hard washable surfaces?
An interesting conversation. I spent 6 hours on theater seats yesterday. Here's the good news. COVID doesn't transmit easily through materials. Obviously, solid surfaces are better. Vinyls and plastics are better. Very open weave fabrics have a few more issues to them, but the industry is moving very quickly, and you're seeing the industry produce already materials that will actually kill the virus within seconds. So what is always positive to see and you can hope that that's a little bit of a silver lining, industry responds quickly when we need products like that. So we will be very aware of the surfaces that we use. And just to elaborate a little further on that, by the time you open, there won't be touchscreens. All new touchscreens will be by proximity. You'll get within a few inches and you'll activate a screen, so you won't have to touch a screen anymore. Everything will be proximity activated. So there's a lot of thought going into that in the marketplace. And then ultraviolet, a certain form of ultraviolet sources being built into institutions, all kinds of things that we have to consider.
How do you make sure that the gee whiz aspects of the new technology don't overwhelm or undermine the somber, serious aspects of the Holocaust?
I think it's how the team makes the decision on when technology is going to enhance the experience versus when technology will overwhelm the experience. And that's a question that we ask every day as we go through this. So there's a lot of really careful thought going into it. There are times that the enhancement of it will make it more emotional, but there's also times where we want to be sure that the pure moment with an artifact or the pure moment with an oral history is the most important it can be and is not overwhelmed by the impact of the technology itself. So a lot of really careful consideration going into that right now.
You did not include tourists in your list of targeted visitors. Do you think that is an area we will or should target?
You will eventually, tourists will come when they hear all the good buzz that this is a great museum. The reason we've targeted those specific individuals or specific groups is we want to be sure that we're serving the community first. Tourists tend to gravitate toward experiences that get good social media responses, and members of the community say, you should go here, it's a great museum. So I think that tourists are a natural reaction of the quality of the experience, and yes, they're more than welcome to come, but we do want to be sure that we're first and foremost serving our community.
All right. Will there be docent training in the new museum before the museum opens to the public?
Absolutely, 100%.
Back to the proximity screens. Is there a way to isolate the proximity screen so only one visitor at a time can use it and it does not cause confusion?
There is, if that's what we want it to do. Many of them are multi-user based. And the reason they're multi-user based is people learn based on how a person next to them engages with content as well, and the kind of questions they ask and the kind of responses they have. So again, it goes back to that, what's the appropriate interface for the appropriate story? And we're looking at those carefully with each level of engagement that a visitor has the potential to be involved in at this museum.
How many visitors will be able to visit in the museum at one time? What is the maximum capacity?
Oh, That's a good question. I don't have that number off the top of my head. We're doing, as you can see in the modeling, we're doing capacity studies right now. So I know that in the next few weeks, we're going to have capacities. We do have a capacity number from the fire marshal, and I can't recall that right now. So I can get back to whoever asked that question with a response via email when my design team digs in with the fire marshal and they finish their capacity studies.
I'm sure now that he asked it, everyone's wanting to know. So I bet we'll update everyone when you have that.
Yep.
At this moment, there are no additional questions. So if I accidentally missed your question, or if you have another question, please type it in. As I said that, I just got a few more. To what degree would you say the visitors will have an experiential experience?
Well, I think that I'm hoping that the entire museum is experiential on different levels emotionally. I think it's critically important that when you're in a story, that story kind of envelops you and is a total experience. So it's the framework for how we think about what the guest experience really is throughout the museum and in the Impact Lab, that you want it to be experiential and with as many of their senses as possible. So thinking about texture and lighting and color and sound and all the things that motivate how you think about something or how you feel about something will be critical in every step of the experience through the museum. There's clearly no more emotional story than the emotional arc of the Holocaust. So this will be a deeply experiential museum.
What do you think of the use of holograms?
Well, we're the first firm in the country to use holograms for Holocaust survivors. We did the first installation in Chicago. For those of you who have been to the Skokie Center, we're doing them. We have 3 going into the new museum in Israel. They're powerful. They have to be appropriate for the museum in regards to space, operations. We are thinking about how they could be used here, so it's clearly on the table for discussion. I don't think we have an answer yet, but it's clearly part of our dialogue.
I've been directed that this is the last question, and this is all that we have. We don't have any pending ones after this. So how will visitor feedback be collected? Will it be in the reflection area?
There will be opportunities for visitors to leave their reaction. There'll be some physical spots for them to do that, and there'll also obviously be a web-based opportunity for them to feedback to the museum. I mentioned this earlier in our presentation. Social media is an important part of gathering visitors' memories or thoughts about the experience, and we learn from that. We learn, are we telling the right perspective? Are there things here that are really working for people? Are there questions that need more answers? So we absolutely want to have places for visitors to feed back to us, because again, if we don't allow them to do it in the museum, they're going to sit in their car on social media, and then it doesn't help us to learn. It just goes out into the wider discussion, and we really want to learn from our visitors.
All right, that is all we have for questions. Am I passing it off to Carol?
Thanks so much, Patrick. That was so informative, not only, about museums in general, but our museum specifically, and so exciting to see all this coming to fruition after thinking about this for a long time. So, and also thank you all for participating and for your great questions. And again, if you have more questions, as you see on the screen, you can contact Jane Langsam at the Federation or go to hmlc.org. Or you can always call me or email me as well. And thank you so much, everybody. Have a good evening.
Bye, everyone.